Bob Lazar, a name that has been at the center of the UFO debate for decades now. He has been called a hoax by many trying to discredit his claims, and a hero by a community of people hoping to prove that UFOs and their extraterrestrial origins are real. Bob Lazar's story is a wild ride that includes U.S. government possession of multiple UFOs and a dark government cover-up to discredit the stories Lazar has shared with the media. There are a lot of claims made about UFOs. Hoaxes and false claims are made in large quantities. I don't believe even a fanatical UFO believer would argue that. But there's always been something different about the claims of Bob Lazar. It is important to note that his story has stayed very much the same for decades. The story surrounding Bob Lazar begins in the late 1980s, when he was hired by the Department of the Navy through EG&G. EG&G was a national defense company, and he was hired to work on a field propulsion system, which was a specialty of Lazar's. Lazar claims in an interview he did with Art Bell that the job seemed like it would be a normal research and development job, which also seemed like a natural progression from work he had done previously at Los Alamos National Laboratory. There, he claims he worked on a linear particle accelerator. This job may or may not have been helped along by a chance encounter Lazar had with the father of the hydrogen bomb, Edward Teller, at Los Alamos Labs, where they supposedly talked about Lazar's interest in advanced engine propulsion. Lazar has said that he would go to the McCarran Airport in Las Vegas and then be flown to Groom Lake in Nevada to report for work, also known as Area 51. Lazar claims this is not where he worked, however. He has stated that he and others he worked with were taken by a bus about 10 or 15 miles south of Groom Lake to an area he calls S4. Lazar claims that the workplace environment was very oppressive and that he could not discuss any of his work with anyone except for a buddy, a person he worked with. In other words, there was only one other person in the whole place that he worked with closely and that he could discuss things with, which goes against all typical scientific environment. When Lazar first begins to be called in for work, he is put through a myriad of tests, which include security clearance, allergy tests, psychological questioning, and is given a brief description of what he was going to be working on. What they ended up working on astonished Lazar. One day, Lazar is led in through a hangar door. Now, this hangar had been built and camouflaged to look like the side of a mountain. This is Lazar's claim, and that the hangar itself was built into the mountain, and the outside of the hangar was camouflaged so that you couldn't distinguish that it was actually a building. Now, this was a different entrance than Lazar typically used, and in the hangar door, he says was a craft. Lazar describes it as a sleek-looking, very stereotypical flying saucer. Lazar claims he thought it must have been a next-generation fighter plane, which he dubbed the sports model. He was able to walk right by it, and the door was removed from the craft. At this point, he believed this to be a U.S. military craft, and the fact that it had a United States flag on it supported that belief. He claims to have reached out and touched it and says it looked and appeared to be metal and that it was cool to the touch. Lazar claims there were other crafts that were there and there were differences between them, but he was only able to work and see the sports model. Lazar's belief that the craft were U.S. military begins to change. Now, it should be stated that he was told in a briefing that crafts were extraterrestrial, so he was told this before he started working. But he believed that these stories he were being told, this claim of extraterrestrial crafts, He believed that they were told this information as another part of the psychological test that I mentioned earlier. He learns that his job is to reverse engineer the propulsion system of this craft, and Lazar says that he was only allowed to work on the propulsion part of the craft and not allowed to study any other part of it. In fact, everything in the whole project is compartmentalized, like how I mentioned he only had one buddy he worked with who he could talk to anything about. Lazar describes the craft in great detail. In the room, there is a reactor about 2 feet in diameter and an emitter about 2 feet in diameter and 4 feet long that look like stacked plates, and describes them as being black in color. There are more details that can be looked up about the description of these objects, but the key point here is that Lazar states that these were used as an engine using gravity, and that these crafts were able to move by effectively falling into a point of gravity projected in front of the craft. Lazar doesn't skirt around how it works, and in interviews gets very detailed on gravity and scientific discussion about how the devices work that go past the basic concept of rudimentary science. Suffice it to say, Lazar claims that when the device was turned on, a black point of gravity would be created through the emitter. Bob Lazar describes his emotion of working on this project as ominous and unearthly. He has stated that everything inside the craft was one color, a metallic dull metal color. He says there were no sharp angles, no seams, and it seemed like everything was injection molded. In other words, nothing was made in a way that was familiar with normal construction and engineering. He describes the craft as 52 feet in diameter and 16 feet high, and that it was 3 levels. There were 3 seats, all faced in one direction. He also states there were no buttons, no switches, no wiring, or anything you would have expected to find. Lazar explained in many interviews that they came across an element that did not exist on the periodic table called element 115. This is going to be an important part of Lazar's claim. Lazar said there were 223 grams of the element in the reactor, and though he never admitted to it, there are rumors that he was able to sneak some of the element 115 out of the building. There seems to be a jovial denial in many interviews that would lead you to believe that he may have had some of this in his possession at one time. In fact, some insist that Lazar still has element 115 and keeps it as an insurance policy to protect himself from being killed by the government. More on that rabbit hole later. Interestingly, an article in National Geographic published in 2013 states that a new element had been found. An unnamed element had first been discovered 10 years earlier in Moscow, and now element 115 was being officially recognized. It was later named moscovium, and only a few atoms of moscovium have ever been made. Furthermore, in an interview with Larry King in 2019, Lazar claims that they have found, when exposed to radiation, it produces its own anti-gravitational field. Now, that's a claim of Bob Lazar, not the article from National Geographic. Lazar had been working, according to his account, on an on-call basis, so they would call him in when they needed him. He began to not be called into work, and this leads to an even darker chapter. Lazar thinks he was essentially not being called in because his wife filed for divorce, and created doubt that Lazar could stay emotionally and psychologically stable. Bob Lazar then makes an important decision. He claims that bad things began to start happening to him, and that they just aren't coincidental. Lazar was fearful that since he was no longer needed and had so much interaction with the classified projects, his life could be in danger, and he decided to go public for his own safety. Now it is time to introduce a new character to this story, George Knapp. George Knapp was a local Las Vegas news anchor at the time, and he had been doing stories on UFOs and cover-ups. He began investigating Lazar's story, and George Knapp originally was skeptical, but ended up becoming a staunch believer in Lazar's extraterrestrial tale. Lazar agrees to be interviewed for the news, and in a televised news segment, Lazar appears in interviews as a shadowy black figure named Dennis, which happened to be the name of his superior at S4. Lazar claims that after the interviews, he was called by his former superior, Dennis, and told, "Do you know what we're going to do to you now?" Bob Lazar claims that there were a total of 9 discs that he saw while working at S4, and he also took friends to an outside area where he worked, and many have claimed they saw the crafts flying around that Lazar claimed to have worked on. There have been many questions about the authenticity of Lazar's story. Lazar claims to have degrees from both MIT in physics and Caltech in electronics. However, both institutions claim that Lazar never attended their institutions. In fact, Los Alamos National Laboratories has also denied that Lazar worked there. Very interestingly, there is a Los Alamos Labs phone directory from 1982 that lists Bob Lazar as at the Los Alamos Labs, and there was a newspaper article that credited Lazar as a physicist working at those labs. Now, a local newspaper ran an article about Lazar that he had put a jet engine on a car, and so they featured this story, but in that article, he's listed as a physicist at the labs. All of a sudden, the story opens up into a wider conspiracy because Lazar claims that the US government was able to remove his records at MIT and at Caltech in retaliation for him going public with this information about S4. In other words, the US government was able to just make him disappear. Lazar agreed to participate in a lie detector test, and the results were inconclusive after passing one part and failing the second. In another battery of tests done by a former Los Angeles police officer, Terry Tavernetti, he puts Lazar through 4 tests and determined there was no intention to deceive. Results were sent to 3 other polygraph specialists, and again, the specialists are split on Lazar's results. But even in interviews today, Terry Tavernetti seems to think that Lazar is being authentic and that any discrepancy in those tests was essentially like fear of Lazar talking about what he was talking about. But we still have inconclusive tests here. Lazar does begin to have some run-in with the law after he blows the whistle. Lazar pleaded guilty and was convicted of felony pandering in 1990. In 2006, Lazar and his wife were charged with violating the Federal Hazardous Substances Act for shipping restricted chemicals across state lines. They were found guilty in 2007, and United Nuclear was sentenced to pay a fine of $7,500, and they had to serve 3 years of probation. This charge came from a raid on United Nuclear in 2003. Lazar claims there were all attempts to discredit him, and that the raid drummed up to confiscate Element 115, which is interesting because this is kind of an admission that he in fact does have Element 115. It should be mentioned that Bob Lazar, as far as I can tell, has received very little, if any, monetary gain for his story, which has brought him so much ridicule. Lazar also states that at the time he didn't believe in UFOs, and while he believes in the possible existence of life elsewhere in the universe, he considered most of the people discussing UFOs at the time as crackpots. In the 90s, stated that he did not keep up with what was being discussed in the UFO community. For many years, he never published any books. He did not join any kind of UFO lecture circuit or really seem interested in being in the spotlight at all. In recent years, though, he has been seen more in the media, and he even participated in a documentary on Netflix called Bob Lazar, Area 51 and Flying Saucers. Did Bob Lazar encounter and work with alien technology in Nevada? Or was this an elaborate story created to dupe UFO enthusiasts? We may never know the answer, but the story of Lazar continues to grow. You have been listening to The Witching Hours. Make sure to follow The Witching Hours on YouTube and Twitter. You can listen to The Witching Hours wherever you find your podcasts.